He didn't have 6 months to live. He had an appointment with a blonde named Tiffany at the Powerhouse Gym on 4th Street, and he was currently bench pressing 225 pounds, while his failing heart beat with the absolute, terrifying perfection of a professional athlete. I stood behind the tinted glass of the studio door, gripping a manila envelope that contained every single piece of my liquidated life. My retirement fund, my dead mother's sold jewelry, the equity from our beautiful suburban home. All gone, liquidated into cold, hard cash, and wired into a dummy medical account in Switzerland to pay for an experimental, off-the-grid gene therapy that was supposedly keeping my husband, Marcus, from dropping dead in our kitchen. "Just 3 more sets, babe," the blonde giggled, her manicured hand resting flat against his sweaty, chiseled chest. The same chest I had wept over just 48 hours ago, listening for an erratic heartbeat, praying to God that I could trade my own life for his. Marcus laughed. It was that deep, rumbling baritone that used to make me feel safe. He grabbed her waist, pulled her close, and kissed her right there on the gym floor. In that exact second, the grieving, broken wife I had been for the last 8 months died, and someone else took her place. Before we get deeper into this absolute madness, I have to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button right now, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely need to hear. The foundational lie of my marriage didn't begin with a sudden medical emergency. It began with the immaculate, calculated perfection of Marcus Reed. To understand how deeply I fell into his trap, you have to understand who he was when he entered my life 6 years ago. I am a financial analyst by trade, a data auditor for a mid-sized corporate firm in Manhattan. My entire professional existence is dedicated to detecting anomalies, uncovering hidden liabilities, and verifying numbers. I don't rely on intuition. I rely on balance sheets, verifiable assets, and historical data. Yet when Marcus swept into my life, he didn't just bypass my professional skepticism. He completely dismantled it. We met at a charity gala in the city. He was a high-end real estate developer, the principal of a boutique firm specializing in luxury residential conversions in Brooklyn and Connecticut. He possessed that rare, magnetic charisma that instantly altered the gravity of whatever room he walked into. He was tall, meticulously well-dressed in tailored charcoal suits, and carried himself with the effortless confidence of someone who had never known financial insecurity. When he looked at me, he made me feel like the only person in a room of 500 people. His courtship was an absolute masterclass in romantic escalation. Within 3 months, he knew my favorite vintage wines, my appreciation for old jazz, and the exact names of the specific suburbs where I dreamed of one day owning a home. He presented himself as the ultimate provider, protective, ambitious, and utterly devoted. 2 years into the relationship, he proposed on a private yacht charter in Miami, silhouetted against the glowing city skyline. It felt like an absolute fairy tale, a cinematic manifestation of the perfect life. Shortly after the honeymoon, we purchased a gorgeous 4-bedroom colonial home in an upscale, tree-lined neighborhood in Greenwich, Connecticut. The property was beautiful, a sprawling lawn, a gourmet kitchen with marble countertops, and a sunlit study where I spent my weekends reading. Marcus took total charge of the mortgage arrangements and the initial property acquisition documents, explaining that his real estate background allowed him to navigate the commercial financing options far more efficiently than I could. I trusted him implicitly. He was my husband, my partner, the man I intended to grow old with. We established a deeply comforting, intimate routine. Every Sunday morning, he would wake up early, put on an old Miles Davis vinyl record, and make blueberry pancakes from scratch while dancing with me across the pristine hardwood kitchen floor. I believed with every fiber of my being that I was the luckiest woman alive. Then, the illusion shattered into pieces on a rainy Tuesday morning in late October. We were in the kitchen, going through our usual morning rush. Marcus was dressed for a meeting with a group of international investors, standing near the kitchen island while adjusting his silk tie. I was pouring coffee, talking about a corporate audit I had to complete by Friday. Without a single warning sign, Marcus gasped. It wasn't a standard sigh or a cough. It was a violent, desperate inhalation, like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. I turned around just in time to see his eyes roll back into his head. His hands clutched frantically at his chest, tearing at his pristine white dress shirt, ripping the buttons away. His knees buckled, and his heavy frame hit the hardwood floor with a terrifying, resonant thud. He began to convulse slightly, his face rapidly turning an awful, mottled shade of blue-gray. He was completely unresponsive, his mouth open as he made horrific, wet, choking sounds, fighting for a single breath of oxygen. Panic, absolute and blinding, consumed me. I dropped my coffee mug, the ceramic shattering on the floor, hot liquid splashing across my shoes. I fell to my knees beside him, my hands shaking so violently I could barely unlock my phone. I dialed 911, screaming our address into the receiver, my voice cracking with an agonizing terror I had never experienced in my life. My husband collapsed. He's not breathing right. He's clutching his chest. Please, God, send an ambulance, I wailed, pressing my hand against his cold, sweaty forehead. His skin felt clammy and dead. I spent the next 12 agonizing minutes performing chest compressions, feeling the sickening flex of his ribs beneath my palms, praying out loud, begging the universe not to take him away from me. When the paramedics finally kicked open our front door, they pushed me aside, immediately hooking him up to a portable defibrillator and administering high-flow oxygen. They loaded him onto a gurney, his face still terrifyingly pale, and rushed him to the local medical center under a full police escort. I followed closely behind in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My tears blurred the red brake lights of the ambulance in front of me. I spent nearly 7 agonizing hours in the private waiting room of the hospital's cardiac care unit. The silence of that room was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional generic announcement over the public address system. I paced the floor, completely consumed by a dark, suffocating dread. Every worst-case scenario flashed through my mind. A massive myocardial infarction, an aneurysm, an undiagnosed congenital defect. I realized in those quiet hours that my entire identity was completely anchored to this man. If he died, my world died with him. At around 5 p.m., the heavy double doors of the ward pushed open. A man stepped into the waiting room, wearing a spotless white lab coat, with a stethoscope draped neatly around his neck. He carried a thick, premium leather binder under his arm, and carried himself with a heavy, somber dignity. He introduced himself as Dr. Jonathan Vance, a senior consultant specializing in rare, degenerative cardiovascular pathologies. Mrs. Reed, Dr. Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, deeply empathetic whisper as he guided me toward a small couch. I am not going to sugarcoat this situation. Your husband didn't suffer a standard heart attack. The diagnostic scans we performed over the last few hours have revealed a much more sinister reality. Marcus is suffering from an advanced, aggressive form of idiopathic cardiomyopathy. The words felt completely foreign, striking my ears like a physical blow. What exactly does that mean? I stammered, my hands gripping my purse for stability. Dr. Vance opened his leather binder, revealing complex, official-looking cardiac diagrams and high-contrast ultrasound printouts with Marcus's legal name printed clearly across the top header. He pointed to a thickened, dark mass on the diagram. In standard terms, Mrs. Reed, it is a highly atypical degenerative muscle condition that is entirely resistant to conventional pharmaceuticals, beta blockers, or standard surgical interventions. Essentially, your husband's heart muscle is undergoing an accelerated process of cellular calcification. Over the next several months, his heart will gradually lose its elasticity. It is turning to stone. A cold, icy numbness washed over my entire body. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. There has to be something we can do, I pleaded, grabbing the doctor's sleeve, tears streaming down my cheeks. A heart transplant list? We can get him on the National Donor Registry immediately. Dr. Vance shook his head slowly, a look of profound sorrow in his eyes. I'm afraid that's impossible.
The systemic inflammation caused by this specific pathology means his immune system would aggressively reject a donor organ within 48 hours. The conventional medical system has no answer for him. Left untreated, his life expectancy is less than 6 months. His heart will simply stop contracting. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably, the weight of the diagnosis crushing the breath from my lungs. However, Dr. Vance continued, pausing deliberately, his voice taking on a cautious, confidential tone, there is one potential lifeline. It is an advanced, highly experimental cellular restoration therapy developed by a private elite biomedical firm based out of Zurich, Switzerland. The treatment utilizes targeted genetic infusions designed to inhibit the calcification process and actively rebuild the myocardial tissue at a molecular level. It is completely off the grid, unapproved by domestic insurance providers because it is still in its proprietary phase.
I looked up, a desperate glimmer of hope igniting in my chest. How much? I don't care what it costs. Dr. Vance sighed, looking down at his charts with a calculated gravity. Because the synthetic proteins must be manufactured individually for his DNA profile in a specialized Swiss laboratory, each targeted infusion session costs $80,000. To fully stabilize his cardiac tissue and guarantee long-term survival, he will require a minimum of 10 consecutive treatments over the next year. That is $800,000 in total, excluding administrative and medical facility fees. And because it is completely experimental, the biomedical firm requires direct wire transfers in liquid cash prior to the scheduling of each session. No payment plans, no financing. $800,000. It was an astronomical, terrifying sum of money, an amount that would completely dismantle our financial stability. Shortly after the consultation, Dr. Vance allowed me into the private ICU cubicle to see Marcus. The sight broke my heart into a million pieces. The strong, vibrant, larger-than-life man I loved was lying helpless beneath the harsh fluorescent medical lights. He was hooked up to a web of complex monitoring equipment, a clear oxygen mask strapped to his face, a steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filling the sterile room. He looked incredibly frail, his broad shoulders slumped, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. As I stepped up to the bedside, he turned his head slowly toward me, his lip trembling violently, tears welling in his eyes. He slipped his hand out from under the thin hospital sheet, his fingers cold and weak as they weakly grasped mine.
"Chloe, I'm so incredibly scared," he whispered, his voice cracking into a raw, pathetic wheeze, his chest heaving with visible effort behind the plastic mask. "I heard what Dr. Vance said outside. I know how much it costs. $800,000. We don't have that kind of liquid cash sitting in a bank account. It's too much. It will ruin you, Chloe. I can't let you destroy your future just to buy me a few extra months of agonizing life. Let me just go. Let the disease take its course. I just want to die peacefully here, holding your hand." Listening to him beg for death, watching him attempt to sacrifice his own life to preserve my financial security, triggered a profound, overwhelming wave of fierce, protective love inside me. Every analytical instinct I possessed was completely drowned out by pure emotion. This was my husband. This was the man who danced with me in the kitchen, the man who had promised to protect me forever. If the roles were reversed, he wouldn't hesitate for a single second to spend every penny to save me. I squeezed his hand tightly, leaning down until my forehead rested against his, my tears mixing with the sweat on his cheek. "No, Marcus, absolutely not. Listen to me very carefully," I whispered fiercely, my voice vibrating with absolute conviction. "I don't care about the money. I don't care about the cost or the debt or the house. Money is just paper, Marcus. It can be re-earned, rebuilt, and replaced. You cannot be replaced. I am not going to sit back and watch you die because of a number on a balance sheet. We will find a way. We will sell everything if we have to. I am going to save your life, Marcus. I am not losing you." Marcus closed his eyes, a single heavy tear slipping down his cheek as he nodded weakly, murmuring his gratitude over and over again.
And in that exact moment, wrapped in the sterile, heartbreaking atmosphere of that intensive care unit, I willingly signed my own financial execution order, completely unaware that every single aspect of the tragedy had been masterfully orchestrated to exploit the deepest depths of my devotion.
Over the next 6 months, my entire existence became a desperate, exhausting hustle for survival. I stopped being a human being with desires, hobbies, or a social life. I became a machine designed to generate, extract, and transfer massive sums of liquid cash. As a financial analyst, I knew exactly how to move money quickly. But doing it under the crushing weight of panic and a ticking biological clock made every transaction feel like a high-stakes gamble, where a single delay could cost my husband his life. The liquidation process was swift, brutal, and systematic. The first thing to go was my personal pride and security. I walked into a high-end estate jeweler downtown with a velvet-lined box containing my dead mother's heirloom collection. These were pieces that had been passed down through 3 generations: her vintage platinum engagement ring, an Art Deco diamond filigree bracelet, and a delicate strand of South Sea pearls she had worn on her wedding day. The jeweler, a clinical man with a magnifying loupe pressed against his eye, offered me pennies on the dollar, capitalizing on the raw desperation vibrating through my voice. I didn't even argue. I signed the paperwork, walked out with a cashier's check for $42,000, and sobbed into my steering wheel for 20 minutes before driving straight to the bank to wire the funds. Next came my retirement infrastructure. I completely emptied my corporate 401k and a supplementary investment portfolio I had been building since my early 20s. Because I was withdrawing nearly $300,000 years before retirement age, the IRS penalized me aggressively. I watched, sick to my stomach, as tens of thousands of dollars vanished instantly into government penalties and early withdrawal fees. My colleagues at work noticed the change. I stopped participating in office lunches, stopped buying my morning lattes, and began wearing the same 3 faded pantsuits on rotation. I was living on instant ramen, stale break room coffee, and absolute adrenaline. When those accounts were completely drained, the reality of our situation forced us to make the ultimate sacrifice: our home. The beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, the house with the sunlit study and the hardwood kitchen where we used to dance, was rushed onto the market at a below-value asking price to ensure an immediate cash buyer. We sold it within 3 weeks. After paying off the primary mortgage structure that Marcus had set up, the remaining equity was supposed to be our safety net. Instead, it was instantly swallowed by the next 2 installments of his Swiss gene infusions.
We packed up our lives into cardboard boxes and moved into a cramped, depressing 1-bedroom apartment situated right next to the Metro North railway tracks in a gritty commercial district. The walls were paper thin. The laminate flooring was peeling at the corners. And every 45 minutes, the entire building would shudder violently as the commuter train roared past. Marcus looked devastated during the move. He sat on a packing crate, holding his chest, apologizing over and over again for ruining our lives. I would drop to my knees, kiss his trembling hands, and tell him that as long as his heart was beating, we had everything we needed. Every 3 weeks, like clockwork, the routine repeated. I would receive a highly formal, encrypted email invoice from the Vance Cardiovascular and Regenerative Institute, detailed with complex medical jargon, routing tracking numbers, and international banking codes. The instructions were always explicit. To prevent domestic regulatory delays or IRS holds on experimental medical funding, the money had to be wired through a secure intermediary bank in Luxembourg, which would then route the cash into a private Tier 1 medical escrow account in Zurich. I would authorize the transfer of $80,000 at a time, watching our available balance plunge toward zero, waiting for the frantic text from Marcus letting me know the Swiss lab had released that week's synthetic protein batch that month. Marcus would leave early on those morning appointments, dressed in heavy, oversized fleece jackets and thick sweatpants. He claimed the treatments caused severe, localized hypothermia and deep tissue inflammation, making his joints ache so badly he could barely walk. When he returned later in the evening, he would look utterly shattered. He would stumble through the front door of our tiny apartment, his face pale,
his breathing shallow, and collapse directly onto our mattress. He would sleep for 14, sometimes 16 hours straight, wrapped in 3 heavy blankets, while I sat beside him in the dark, counting his respirations, monitoring the erratic rhythm of his pulse, and thanking God that we had the means to keep him alive for another month. But around the middle of the 7th month, the flawless narrative of Marcus's tragic illness began to develop tiny, almost imperceptible microfractures.
Because my brain is professionally wired to perform rigorous forensic audits, I am hyper-aware of patterns, anomalies, and structural inconsistencies. In my line of work, if a company's revenue numbers are climbing while their operational physical assets are decreasing, it's an immediate red flag that indicates cooking the books. Human biology operates under similar, immutable laws of data. Marcus was supposedly suffering from an aggressive, degenerative cardiac pathology that altered his cellular metabolism and caused chronic myocardial fatigue. By all medical logic, a patient undergoing this level of systemic trauma should exhibit noticeable physical wasting. They should experience muscle atrophy, significant weight loss, lethargy, and a general loss of physical density. Yet, as I sat across from Marcus at our small laminate kitchen table, I realized he didn't look like a dying man. In fact, he looked remarkably robust. His shoulders were broader, his trap muscles looked thicker beneath his t-shirts, and his jawline possessed a sharp, chiseled definition that he hadn't even had during our luxury lifestyle in Greenwich. When he stood up to walk to the bathroom, his stride was firm and grounded. There was no systemic weakness in his posture. One evening, while he was resting after a supposedly agonizing infusion session, I walked past his chair and gently placed my hand against his bare shoulder to smooth his hair. The muscle beneath my fingers felt like solid iron, dense, hydrated, and perfectly conditioned. "Marcus, honey," I murmured, keeping my voice soft, entirely devoid of accusation. "You look different. Your muscle mass hasn't depleted at all. If anything, you look bigger." He didn't miss a beat. He gave me a weary, deeply sorrowful smile, his eyes instantly welling with that familiar, tragic vulnerability. He reached up, taking my hand and pressing it against his sternum.
I know, sweetie. It's one of the most agonizing side effects of the Swiss gene therapy, he explained, his voice dropping to a low, painful rasp. The synthetic proteins cause massive, localized water retention and severe deep tissue hypertrophy. My muscles are constantly swelling and inflamed because the body is trying to reject the cellular integration. It looks like muscle, but it's actually incredibly painful edema. Some mornings, I can barely close my fists because the fluid buildup is so intense. I felt an immediate, sickening wave of guilt wash over me. How could I be so cold, so analytical, to critique my husband's physical appearance while he was literally enduring a painful experimental medical trial just to stay alive for me? I apologized profusely, kissed his forehead, and buried my suspicions deep into the back of my mind. But the universe has a strange way of forcing the truth through the cracks, and a week later, the laundry room in our basement became the catalyst for my total unraveling. It was a bleak Thursday night. Marcus had gone to bed early, completely wiped out from what he described as a grueling 4-hour diagnostic ultrasound sequence. I gathered a basket of his dirty clothes and went down to the damp, fluorescent-lit basement of our apartment building to use the coin-operated washing machines. I was sorting through his darks, separating his t-shirts, when I picked up a pair of his heavy, gray fleece sweatpants, the ones he always wore to his upstate clinic appointments. As a matter of lifelong habit, I reached my hand deep into the front right pocket to ensure there were no stray tissues or coins that could damage the washing machine drum. My fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of crumpled paper.
I pulled it out. It was a standard, heat-printed register receipt from a high-end, elite sports nutrition and bodybuilding supplement store located on 4th Street in downtown Manhattan. The timestamp on the top of the receipt read 11:42 a.m. on Tuesday morning, the exact window of time when Marcus was supposedly strapped to a medical table upstate with an IV line running into his jugular vein. My eyes scanned down the line items on the receipt. 1X Isoway Premium Protein Hydrolysate,
vanilla cream, $85. 1X Hyperdrive Nitro High Stimulant Pre-Workout Matrix Workout, $60. Total, $145. Payment method, Visa ending in 4412. I stood frozen in that damp basement, the hum of the industrial dryers vibrating through the concrete floor beneath my feet. The analytical, data-driven part of my brain instantly went into overdrive, calculating variables at lightning speed. Hyperdrive Nitro was a notorious black market grade workout supplement, loaded with synthetic caffeine, nitric oxide boosters, and heavy cardiac stimulants, designed to dramatically spike a person's heart rate and maximize blood flow during high-intensity weightlifting.
If a man with an advanced, degenerative cardiomyopathy, a man whose heart muscle was allegedly turning to stone, took even a quarter scoop of a high-stimulant pre-workout formula, his heart would instantly experience a catastrophic arrhythmia. It would literally kill him. It was medical suicide. Furthermore, the credit card number listed at the bottom of the receipt didn't match any of our shared checking or credit accounts. I knew our financial portfolio inside and out. We didn't own a Visa card ending in 4412. All of our personal credit lines had been completely maxed out and closed months ago to fund his treatments. A cold, heavy bead of sweat traced a slow line down my spine. The receipt felt like a burning ember in my palm. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he had bought it for a friend, maybe someone else had dropped a receipt in his pocket at the clinic, but the discrepancies were mounting, and the mathematical probability of a clean explanation was dropping closer to zero by the second. The final, devastating crack in the dam occurred 3 days later on a Sunday afternoon. Marcus was in the bathroom, taking one of his long, luxurious, steaming hot showers to soothe his inflamed muscle tissues. He had left his personal iPad lying flat on the laminate kitchen counter, next to the toaster. He usually kept all of his devices heavily locked with complex alphanumeric passwords, but he had evidently been using it to stream a podcast right before stepping into the shower, and the screen timer hadn't kicked in yet. The device vibrated on the counter with a soft, distinct chime. The screen illuminated, displaying a banner notification from an automated luxury travel booking platform. My eyes darted toward the closed bathroom door. The running water was steady and loud. I stepped over to the counter, my heart hammering against my ribs with an unsettling, erratic cadence that mirrored the very disease my husband was supposed to have. I looked down at the notification.
Your upcoming reservation for 2 guests at the Ammon Resort, Canyon Point, Utah, has been successfully processed and confirmed. Check-in, Friday, June 12th. Total amount paid, $9,600. We look forward to welcoming you to the desert. June 12th. That was next Friday. That was the exact, highly critical weekend that Marcus had spent weeks preparing me for. The weekend he told me he had to be completely isolated in the intensive care wing of the upstate clinic for a continuous 48-hour deep tissue cellular infusion that required total patient quarantine. He had told me he wouldn't even be able to use his cell phone because the medical equipment in the clean room interfered with cellular frequencies. 2 guests, nearly $10,000 for a weekend at an ultra-exclusive, 5-star desert oasis frequented by Hollywood celebrities and tech billionaires. I stared at the glowing screen, my hands shaking so violently that I accidentally knocked over an empty water glass on the counter. It didn't break, but the loud clatter sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I stood there, completely paralyzed, as the running water in the bathroom suddenly clicked off. "Chloe, everything good out there?" Marcus's strong, clear voice called out through the door. I swallowed hard, forcing my vocal cords to tighten, suppressing the absolute torrent of panic, confusion, and budding rage that was threatening to tear through my throat. "Yeah, everything's fine, honey," I called back, my voice sounding incredibly thin, detached, and artificial. "Just dropped a glass. Don't worry about it."
I quickly stepped away from the counter, retreating to the far corner of the living room as the bathroom door swung open. Marcus stepped out, a plush towel wrapped around his waist, steam billowing out behind him. His skin looked radiant, healthy, and flush with vibrant, oxygenated blood. He smiled at me, That same beautiful, manipulative smile that had cost me my inheritance, my home, my mother's memories, and my financial sanity. And in that precise moment, as I looked at the perfect alignment of his posture and the absolute health radiating from his frame, the desperate, grieving wife who had spent 7 months crying herself to sleep died. The forensic auditor woke up, and she wanted to see the receipts. I needed absolute, undeniable certainty. In my career as a financial analyst, you never present a fraud case to the board based on a hunch or a single anomalous data point. You wait until you have an ironclad, multi-layered trail of evidence that leaves the target with zero room to maneuver, lie, or restructure their assets. If I confronted Marcus now, armed with nothing but a supplement store receipt and a vague travel notification on an iPad, he would smoothly lie his way out of it. He would claim he was buying the protein for a workout buddy at the clinic, or that the luxury resort email was a sophisticated phishing scam targeting his account. He would turn it back on me, weaponizing my own anxiety against me, making me feel like a paranoid, unhinged wife who was stress testing a dying man's final days. I refused to let him play me like that. I needed to see exactly where the money was going, and more importantly, exactly what he was doing when he stepped out of our cramped, shaking apartment, looking like a tragic victim of genetic misfortune. The escalation began on Monday morning. The moment Marcus left the apartment at 8:15 a.m., kissing my cheek with his usual weak, trembling display of marital affection, I sat down at my laptop. I didn't go to my corporate login. Instead, I opened an encrypted browser window and began executing a thorough forensic digital audit on the Vance Cardiovascular and Regenerative Institute. I started with the state medical board registries. I pulled up the public license verification portal for the state of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. I typed in Jonathan Vance. 0 results. I tried Jonathan E. Vance, Jonah Vance, John Vance. Absolutely nothing. There was not a single licensed practitioner, cardiologist, resident, or medical researcher by any name anywhere in the tri-state area. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, but my fingers kept moving across the keyboard, cold and precise. Next, I looked up the corporate filing data for the address listed on the official medical invoices, the Modern Glass Complex upstate. I ran a commercial property occupancy search through the county clerk's database. The building was real, but the tenants were entirely standard. A boutique family dental practice, an outpatient physical therapy clinic, and a high-end cosmetic dermatology center on the penthouse floor. There was no cardiovascular institute. There was no laboratory space equipped to handle proprietary Swiss genetic engineering. The invoice headers were a total fabrication, expertly designed on a desktop publishing program to look imposing, bureaucratic, and official to a panicked, uninitiated eye. But where was the cash going? Over the last 7 months, I had personally authorized 8 separate wire transfers of $80,000 each. That was $640,000 of my hard-earned life savings, my mother's estate, and our home equity, completely drained out of my domestic accounts. I opened my personal banking portal and pulled up the routing logs for the international wire transfers. The funds weren't going directly to Switzerland. They were being routed through an intermediary brokerage house in Delaware, a notorious tax haven that allows for absolute corporate anonymity, before being transferred into a primary account held by a shell corporation registered under the name Vance Biotech Holdings LLC in the Cayman Islands. As I stared at the routing numbers, a cold, clinical realization washed over me. I didn't have access to the Cayman accounts yet, but I did have the foundational tracking numbers from the domestic side because I was the one who had generated the origin wires from my joint checking account. Because Marcus had insisted on keeping his name off the initial transfer documentation to avoid IRS red flags regarding experimental medical procedures, he had left a massive, glaring vulnerability in his operational security. He had used my clean financial profile and my digital signatures to authorize the foundational corporate pipeline. In the eyes of the banking system, I wasn't just a victim paying a bill. I was technically a primary administrative entity attached to the origin routing structure of the initial corporate pipeline. I needed eyes on the ground.
I couldn't do this alone while maintaining my full-time job and pretending to be the doting, heartbroken wife at home. I closed my laptop, grabbed my purse, and drove downtown to an unassuming commercial office building on 3rd Avenue. I had booked an emergency consultation with a private investigation firm called Apex Security and Verification. The principal investigator was a man named Arthur Miller. He was a gruff, retired NYPD white-collar crimes detective with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He sat across a heavy oak desk from me, quietly reviewing the printouts of the wire transfers, the supplement receipt, and the Amman resort confirmation. He didn't look shocked. He looked at me with a profound, professional understanding that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Reed," Miller said, leaning back in his leather chair and clicking his pen. "I'm going to be straight with you. This has all the classic structural markers of an high-end affinity scam, except the target isn't an investment group. It's you. People think scammers only operate on the internet or in dark alleys, but the most devastating fraudsters are the ones who sleep in your bed. They use your love, your empathy, and your absolute fear of losing them as a human shield to blind your analytical judgment."
"I need proof, Mr. Miller," I said, my voice completely steady, hardened by an icy, absolute resolve. "I don't just want an opinion. I need verifiable, physical, photographic proof of what my husband is doing when he leaves my house. I want a complete behavioral audit of his Tuesday and Friday treatment windows." Miller nodded, sliding a retainer agreement across the desk. "You'll have it. My team will pull a 24-hour surveillance detail on him starting tomorrow morning. If he's going to a clinic, we'll document it. If he's going somewhere else, well, you'll be the first to know." The next 3 days were an absolute psychological living hell. I had to go home and live in that tiny, suffocating apartment with a ghost. A man who was systematically murdering my financial future while pretending to be on the verge of biological collapse. On Wednesday evening, Marcus staged an elaborate performance. We were sitting on our cheap sofa, the apartment vibrating as the 7:15 p.m. commuter train roared past the tracks outside. Marcus suddenly gasped, dropping his fork onto his plate, his hands flying to his ribs. He began to hyperventilate, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony.
"Chloe, the chest pressure, it's tightening," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, strained wheeze. "The calcification, I can feel it. It feels like a physical hand squeezing my lungs. Please, get my medication from the cabinet." 7 months ago, I would have dropped to my knees, sobbing, scrambling through the cabinets, panic paralyzing my lungs. Now, I stood up calmly. I walked to the bathroom, fetched his prescription bottle of mild, generic cardiovascular regulators, which I now knew were completely harmless placebos prescribed for minor blood pressure maintenance, and brought him a glass of water. I sat beside him, gently rubbing his broad, dense back, watching him pretend to swallow the pill and gradually slow his breathing down. As his head rested against my shoulder, his heavy, perfectly conditioned frame pressing against mine, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, terrifying detachment. I was looking at an actor, a brilliant, psychopathic performer who was evaluating my emotional response out of the corner of his eye to see if the illusion was still holding. "Thank you, Angel," he whispered, kissing my neck, his breath warm and steady. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only thing keeping me alive." "I know, Marcus," I murmured into his hair, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper across the room. "I'll do whatever it takes to ensure you get exactly what you deserve."
The breakthrough came on Friday morning, the day of his scheduled deep tissue Swiss infusion. Marcus woke up at 7 a.m., executing his usual routine. He groaned dramatically as he rolled out of bed, holding his lower back and rubbing his sternum. He put on his oversized, heavy fleece jacket and dark sweatpants, looking like a man who was preparing to endure a grueling, freezing medical torment. "The infusions are getting harder, Chloe," he said, his voice trembling as he leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of black coffee. "The Swiss doctors warned me that month 7 would be the peak of the tissue rejection phase.
My body is fighting the genetic alterations. Pray for me today, sweetie. I need every ounce of your strength. I am praying for you, Marcus. Constantly, I said, my voice flat, completely devoid of the desperate emotion I used to project. He left the apartment at 8:15 a.m., walking down the stairwell with a slow, deliberate, heavy slouch, his shoulder dragging against the wall, as if he could barely carry his own weight. 10 minutes later, my cell phone vibrated on the counter. It was a secure text message from Investigator Miller. Target is in his vehicle, white BMW SUV. We have eyes on him. Surveillance team is active. Stay at your location. We will update you in real time.
I didn't stay at my location. I couldn't. The analytical fire inside me was burning too hot. I had taken a formal personal day from my corporate firm, claiming a family emergency. I stepped down to the basement, walked out to the alleyway where my beat-up 10-year-old Honda Civic was parked, and started the engine. I kept a safe, multi-block distance, tracking Miller's real-time location pings through an encrypted tracking link he had shared with me. Marcus didn't drive north toward the highway leading to the upstate medical center. The moment his luxury SUV cleared the local grid, he pulled directly onto the southbound parkway, heading straight into the heart of downtown Manhattan. His slow, erratic driving style completely vanished. He was navigating the heavy morning traffic with aggressive, fluid precision, weaving between lanes with the sharp reflexes of a man in peak physical and mental condition. At 9:02 a.m., his SUV pulled into the secure commercial parking garage underneath a high-end commercial district on 4th Street. The exact neighborhood listed on the supplement store receipt I had pulled from his sweatpants pocket. I parked my Civic 2 blocks away in a public lot, my hands slick with sweat against the steering wheel, my chest tightening with a very different kind of panic than I had felt in the hospital 7 months ago. This was the moment of impact. This was where the data met the reality. I walked down the bustling city sidewalk, blending into the crowd of morning commuters, my eyes locked on the exit of the parking garage. 5 minutes later, Marcus stepped out onto the street.
The transformation was absolute, devastating, and complete. The heavy, oversized fleece jacket was gone. The pathetic, dragging slouch was entirely eradicated. He was dressed in a tight, form-fitting black athletic compression tank top and designer gym shorts that highlighted the massive, dense, sculpted musculature of his shoulders and legs. He looked broader, taller, and more vibrant than he ever had in our entire 6 years together. He carried a sleek, premium leather gym bag slung over his right shoulder. He was walking with a confident, springy, athletic stride, a wide, arrogant smile plastered across his face as he checked his reflection in a storefront window and adjusted his hair. He didn't look back. He didn't look like a man whose heart was turning to stone. He looked like an apex predator in his natural habitat. He turned the corner and walked directly through the tinted, double-glass doors of Powerhouse Gym, an ultra-exclusive, high-intensity fitness club catering to professional athletes, bodybuilders, and wealthy executives. My phone vibrated again. A text from Miller, who was stationed in a parked van across the street. Target has entered the fitness facility. We have an investigator inside on a day pass tracking his movements. Stand by for visual confirmation. I stood on the sidewalk, the bright morning sun beating down on my face. But inside, I was a block of solid ice. The escalation phase was over. The anomalies had been verified. The fraud was absolute. I took a deep, steady breath, straightened my posture, and walked across the street toward the glass doors of the gym. It was time to watch the performance from the front row.
The air inside the main floor of Powerhouse Gym was a suffocating mix of industrial ozone, rubber floor matting, and the heavy metallic scent of iron. Music with a deep, aggressive bass line vibrated through the floorboards, matching the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. I paid the $20 guest fee at the polished concrete front counter, my movements purely mechanical. The young girl working the register didn't even look up from her phone as she slid a plastic barcode wristband across the counter. I strapped it on, walked past the juice bar, and stepped deep into the cavernous belly of the facility. I didn't have to look hard to find him. Marcus was a large man, but today, stripped of his frumpy medical disguises, he looked absolutely massive. He was stationed at the heavy free weight section toward the back of the gym, a space framed by floor-to-ceiling mirrors and illuminated by harsh, unforgiving track lighting. But he wasn't alone. Standing directly behind his weight bench was a gorgeous 20-something blonde woman. She had a deep, flawless golden tan, her hair tied up in a high, bouncy ponytail, and she was wearing a matching designer activewear set that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. She was leaning over him, her manicured hands lightly on the iron barbell as he prepared to lift. "Come on, Marcus," her voice carried over the din of clanking weights, a melodic, flirtatious purr that made my blood run entirely cold. "Push it out, baby. You've got 3 more reps in you. Let's go." Marcus gripped the bar. The barbell was loaded with 2 massive 45-pound iron plates on each side, 225 pounds in total. A man with idiopathic cardiomyopathy, a man whose heart muscle was calcifying into solid stone, would have suffered a fatal thoracic blast the moment his muscles contracted against that kind of resistance.
But Marcus didn't falter. He unracked the heavy iron with a sharp, explosive exhalation. His face flushed a vibrant, healthy crimson as he lowered the bar smoothly to his chest and drove it back up toward the ceiling. 1 rep, 2 reps, 3 reps. His chest expanded with absolute athletic perfection, the thick veins in his biceps and neck bulging with a terrifying rush of pure, oxygenated blood. He wasn't weak. He wasn't dying. He was in the absolute prime of his physical life. On the 3rd rep, he racked the heavy bar with a loud, echoing metallic clang. He sat up immediately, laughing a deep, resonant baritone laugh that I hadn't heard in 8 months. He reached out, grabbed the blonde by her narrow waist, and pulled her down directly onto his lap. She giggled, wrapping her arms around his sweaty neck, and kissed him. A deep, passionate, familiar kiss, right there on the crowded gym floor. I stepped back behind a row of heavy matrix machines, my body completely hidden in the shadows. I pulled my phone from my purse, my fingers perfectly steady. The analytical, cold detachment of a corporate auditor took complete control of my nervous system. I set the camera to high-definition video mode, zoomed in, and hit record. I captured everything. I recorded the way his strong hands gripped her hips. I recorded the vibrant, joyous smile on his face, a face that had spent months weeping in my lap, begging for death. I recorded the blonde reaching into her small designer gym bag and pulling out a sleek black American Express credit card to pay a personal trainer who walked up to check on their progress. Even from 20 feet away, my trained financial eyes recognized the card. It was a secondary account, authorized under the name of Vance Biotech Holdings, LLC, the exact Cayman Islands shell corporation that I had been wiring my mother's estate into.
They weren't just stealing my money. They were actively flaunting it, using my dead mother's jewelry and my liquidated home to finance their high-end fitness lifestyle, their luxury activewear, and their secret parallel romance. My phone vibrated silently in my hand. It was a text from Investigator Miller, who was positioned near the exit doors. My operative inside has pulled the registration records from the gym's database. Marcus Reed is registered under a premium couples membership. The cosigner on his account is Tiffany Vance. We just ran her social. She isn't a medical professional, Mrs. Reed. She's a former luxury hospitality coordinator. And Dr. Jonathan Vance? He's her older brother. He's a non-union theater and commercial actor who has been doing regional dinner theater in New Jersey for the last 5 years. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening, heavy finality. The entire tragedy was a corporate theatrical production. Marcus hadn't stumbled into a medical crisis.
He had engineered a highly sophisticated, emotionally abusive financial extraction scheme. He had targeted me specifically because of my pristine credit rating, my asset profile, and my absolute unwavering devotion to him. He had hired a broke regional actor to wear a white coat and stand in a rented consultation room to deliver a fake death sentence. He had faked the medical records, forged the Swiss invoices, and staged the violent collapse on my kitchen floor, all to trigger an emotional panic that would bypass my professional analytical defenses.
The master plan was brutally transparent. He was going to systematically drain every single dollar I possessed, funnel it safely into the Cayman account managed by his mistress, and then in a few months, he would die during a permanent medical trip to Switzerland. He would fake his own death or disappearance abroad, leave me bankrupt, devastated, and grieving in a shaking apartment by the train tracks, while he jetted off to a non-extradition country under a new identity to spend my life savings with Tiffany Vance. I stopped the recording and saved the video file into 3 separate secure cloud drives. I looked at the mirror across the gym floor, catching a glimpse of my own reflection. I looked tired, my face pale from months of cheap ramen and sleepless nights, but my eyes were brighter and sharper than they had ever been. Marcus had spent his entire life playing a character, believing that his charm and his physical presence made him completely invincible to the rules of data and law. He thought he had left me with nothing, but he had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake in his operational security. He had allowed a professional corporate auditor to see the routing numbers. I didn't scream. I didn't storm across the gym floor to tear the blonde's hair out or slap the sweat off his chiseled face. That is what an emotional victim does. I turned around quietly, walked past the juice bar, exited the building through the glass doors, and stepped back into the bright Manhattan sunshine. I had the data. I had the footage. Now, it was time to close the audit.
Most women in my position would have broken down completely. They would have rushed onto that gym floor, screaming at the top of their lungs, throwing punches, or shattering glass plates back at the apartment. They would have hired a standard family lawyer, filed for an emergency divorce, and dragged the entire sordid affair into a civil courtroom. But a standard divorce is an emotional circus. It takes months to navigate, costs tens of thousands in legal fees, and worst of all, it gives the target time to react. It forces a legal disclosure that would have tipped Marcus off, allowing him to jump on a plane to Dubai or the Cayman Islands with a simple swipe of his thumb, disappearing into a web of untraceable offshore crypto wallets before a judge could even sign a temporary asset freeze. I didn't want a divorce. A divorce implies a dissolution of a partnership. This wasn't a partnership. It was a hostile corporate takeover. I wanted absolute, devastating, unmitigated ruin. So I played my part. For 2 full weeks after that discovery at the gym, I wore the mask of the grieving, desperate, completely broken wife. I held his hand on the sofa when he went into his fake coughing fits. I rubbed his back when he claimed his heart felt like it was expanding with fluid. I woke up at 3 a.m. to bring him glasses of water, watching his face in the dark, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, dark, calculating stillness. Inside my mind, I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a senior forensic auditor closing a multi-million-dollar embezzlement case. The trap was set for a chilly Thursday night, precisely 24 hours before his scheduled final permanent departure to the Swiss clinic for his alleged life-saving gene fusion. I spent the afternoon transforming our cramped, depressing one-bedroom apartment next to the railway tracks into a stage. I bought a high-end bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, his favorite vintage, and prepared 2 thick, premium pan-seared ribeye steaks with rosemary and baked potatoes. I set the table with real ceramic plates, lit 2 long tapered candles, and turned down the harsh overhead fluorescent lighting. It looked like a beautiful, intimate final sanctuary for a dying man. Marcus arrived home at 7:30 p.m. He executed his entrance flawlessly, dragging his feet across the threshold,
his shoulder leaning heavily against the doorframe as he let out a weak, agonizing sigh. He was wearing his oversized fleece jacket, his face twisted into an expression of profound, weary suffering. "Oh, Chloe, what is all this?" he whispered, his voice a pathetic, breathy rasp as he smelled the steak. He looked at the candles, his eyes filling with practiced, manipulative tears. "You shouldn't have done this, Angel. I told you, my stomach, the calcification is making it so hard to digest solid food." "You need your strength for the flight tomorrow, Marcus," I said, my voice incredibly soft, perfectly balancing a tender warmth with a faint, tragic undercurrent. I walked over to him, helped him slide the heavy fleece jacket off his shoulders, and guided him to his chair. "Sit down. Let's just have one perfect, normal night together before you leave for Switzerland."
He sat down with a dramatic groan, rubbing his chest right over his heart. "You're an angel, Chloe. Seriously, if I don't make it through this final round of infusions in Zurich, I want you to know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. I love you more than life itself." "I know you do, Marcus," I said, walking over to the counter to pour the dark red wine into 2 crystal glasses. "Which is why I wanted to give you your going-away present tonight, instead of waiting for the airport tomorrow." I walked over to the table, set his wine glass down, and reached under my chair. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, the structural anchor of my entire investigation. I slid it slowly across the smooth wood of the table, placing it right between his steak plate and his wine glass. Marcus smiled, looking genuinely amused. The candlelight flickered across his sharp, handsome jawline. "What's this, sweetie? A photo album of our times in Greenwich? A collection of letters?" "Open it," I murmured, taking a slow, measured sip of my wine. Marcus reached out, his thick, perfectly manicured fingers, undoing the metal clasp of the envelope. He pulled out the contents. The first page wasn't a photograph of our old house. It was a high-resolution, full-color, glossy printout of a video frame. It captured Marcus in absolute razor-sharp detail, lying flat on a weight bench at the Powerhouse Gym on 4th Street, bench pressing 225 pounds, while a beautiful blonde named Tiffany Vance sat comfortably on his lap, their lips locked in a passionate embrace. The silence that hit the room was sudden, heavy, and absolute. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic clanking of a freight train passing by the tracks outside, making the windows of our small kitchen rattle slightly. The faux frail, sickly expression on Marcus's face didn't just fade, it completely evaporated. The weak, trembling posture straightened instantly. The mask he had worn for 8 agonizing months vanished, exposing the cold, hard, calculating face of the sociopath beneath. "Chloe, what the hell is this?" he stammered. His voice had completely lost its pathetic, breathy tremor. It returned to its natural, deep, forceful baritone. He tried to let out a short, nervous laugh, tossing the photo back onto the table. This is ridiculous. This was a physical therapy session, Chloe. The Swiss doctors explicitly ordered light, resistance-based movement to stimulate myocardial blood flow. And Tiffany, she's a clinical assistant attached to the Upstate Institute. She was just supporting me because I had a dizzy spell on the floor. "Shut up, Marcus," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't hysterical. It was a flat, clinical drone. The exact tone I use when I'm delivering a terminal audit report to a corrupt corporate board. I leaned forward, resting my forearms flat against the table, staring directly into his shifting, dark eyes. The second page in that packet is the full comprehensive background check on Jonathan Vance. He's not a cardiologist, Marcus. He's a non-union commercial actor who does regional dinner theater in New Jersey for $3,000 a month. You paid him $5,000 to wear a white coat and stage a collapse sequence in a public consultation room at the hospital. Marcus stopped talking. His jaw worked silently, a muscle twitching violently underneath his left eye. The third page, I continued, my voice entirely unyielding, is the complete forensic financial audit of Vance Biotech Holdings LLC in the Cayman Islands. I have the tracing logs for every single one of the $8,000 wires I sent.
I have the receipts showing that $42,000 of my dead mother's liquidated jewelry was used to buy Tiffany Vance a brand new white Mercedes-Benz C-Class last month. And I have the confirmation that the $10,000 you pulled out of our emergency fund went toward a couple suite at the Amman Resort in Utah for next weekend. Marcus stared at the documents spread out across the table under the dim candlelight. The evidence was absolute. The data trail left him with zero defensive parameters. Realizing that he could no longer lie, manipulate, or play the victim, his entire demeanor transformed into something terrifyingly arrogant. He pushed his plate aside, leaned back in his chair, crossed his broad arms over his chest, and let out a cold, sharp, vicious laugh.
Wow, I have to admit, Chloe, I underestimated you, he sneered, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated contempt. The quiet little accountant actually did some homework. You caught me. Brilliant. Bravo. He clapped his hands together in a slow, mocking rhythm. But let me ask you a very realistic question, sweetheart, he continued, leaning forward over the table, his voice dripping with venom. So what? What are you going to do about it? Are you going to divorce me? Look around this absolute dump of an apartment. We have nothing left domestically. The house in Greenwich is gone. Your savings accounts are dry. Your retirement is emptied. The money isn't here, Chloe. It is sitting safely in a secure, multi-layered offshore jurisdiction that your local family courts can't touch without 10 years of international litigation. He stood up from his chair, his massive athletic frame towering over me, casting a long, dark shadow across the dinner table. He looked down at me like I was an insignificant insect. You can sue me all you want. You'll just get a useless piece of paper called a civil judgment against a man who technically owns 0 domestic assets. I'm leaving for the airport in 3 hours anyway. My bags are already packed in the car. Tiffany and I are moving to a non-extradition territory, and there is absolutely, fundamentally nothing your numbers can do to stop me. Have fun paying off the debt, you stupid bitch. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't even stand up to meet his gaze. I simply took another calm, measured sip of my Cabernet, looked up at his arrogant, sneering face, and let a cold smile touch my lips. You're entirely right about the offshore accounts, Marcus, I said softly, my voice cutting through the quiet apartment like a razor blade. But you forgot one very critical detail about corporate infrastructure. Marcus paused, his hand gripping the back of his chair, his body frozen mid-turn. That arrogant, victorious sneer was still plastered across his face, but a tiny flicker of uncertainty darted through his dark eyes. He was a predator who believed he had cleared the perimeter, completely unaware that he had walked directly into a steel cage. What the hell are you talking about, Chloe? He snapped, his voice dropping its mocking tone, returning to a harsh, defensive edge. The corporate infrastructure is locked down. I set it up myself. No, Marcus. You set up a theater production, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my legs, completely detached from the physical intimidation of his height. You see, when you had me set up the initial domestic routing codes to bypass tax scrutiny, you wanted to keep your own name off the radar. You were terrified that a large, sudden movement of funds would trigger a personal audit on your real estate shell companies. So you made a critical operational error. You listed me, your financially pristine, certified wife, as the chief financial officer and primary authorizing signee of the parent entity that controlled the domestic pipeline. Marcus's brow furrowed, his chest heaving under his tight shirt. That doesn't give you access to the Cayman accounts. Those are locked behind an international firewall. It gave me access to the origin pipeline, Marcus, I explained, pulling my cell phone out of my pocket and unlocking the screen with a deliberate, soft click. As the primary administrative signee and CFO of the domestic shell, I don't need to fight the Cayman courts. 2 hours ago, I executed an emergency corporate restructuring under the Federal Corporate Fraud Clause. I presented Investigator Miller's complete behavioral audit, the hospital footage,
the background check on the actor Jonathan Vance, and the undisputed video evidence of grand larceny and systemic wire fraud to the Security Compliance Board of our clearinghouse bank. I tapped the screen, illuminating a fresh, digital financial balance statement, and turned the phone face up on the table, sliding it right into the candlelight between our plates. Marcus lunged forward, his eyes locking onto the glowing screen. The primary balance line for Vance Biotech Holdings LLC read $0.00. The secondary operational account attached to Tiffany's Black American Express card read $0.00. "What did you do?" Marcus roared, his voice cracking, his hands hitting the wooden table with a violent force that sent our wine glasses rattling to the floor, the dark red liquid pooling across the laminate wood like a fresh wound. "Where is the money, Chloe? Where is my fucking money?"
It's not your money, Marcus. It's mine. It's my mother's jewelry. It's my house. It's my retirement. I whispered, my voice completely steady, cutting through his explosive rage with the cold precision of a surgeon. The $850,000 you and Tiffany systematically embezzled from my life has been completely liquidated from the offshore structure. It is currently sitting in a secure, frozen domestic escrow account monitored directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. Marcus staggered backward, his face turning an awful, chalky shade of white. The invincibility he had carried into the room collapsed instantly, his shoulders slumping, as the mathematical reality of his total financial annihilation sunk into his brain. You went to the feds?" he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for the edge of the kitchen island to keep himself from falling. "You ruined us. You threw everything away. They're going to investigate both of us. You signed those transfers, Chloe. You're just as guilty as I am." I surrendered the funds voluntarily as the primary reporting whistleblower of an active multi-state wire fraud and identity theft ring. I stood up from my chair for the first time that evening, smoothing down the front of my slacks. In the eyes of the federal government, I am a cooperating victim who uncovered a massive financial crime. In the eyes of the federal government, you are a target. "You bitch!" Marcus screamed, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated psychopathic rage. He abandoned all pretense of civilization. His large, muscular frame lunged across the small kitchen toward me, his hands outstretched, as if he wanted to wrap them around my throat and choke the life out of me right there on the floor. Before his boots could even take a second step across the linoleum, the front door of our apartment didn't just open, it disintegrated. A deafening, explosive crash echoed through the narrow hallway as the doorframe splinters flew into the living room. "FBI, don't move! Put your hands on your head! Put your hands on your head right now!" A tactical team of 4 heavily armed federal agents, clad in dark tactical vests and carrying assault rifles, flooded into our tiny kitchen. The bright, blinding beams of their tactical flashlights cut through the dim candlelight, pinning Marcus against the counter like a deer caught in high beams. "Get on the ground! Face down! Do it now!" a senior agent shouted, his voice a commanding, thunderous boom that broke whatever remaining fight Marcus had left inside him. Marcus spun around, terrified, his hands flying into the air as the agents closed the distance in a fraction of a second. They slammed his massive, athletic frame face first onto the hard laminate floor, striking the exact same spot where he had staged his pathetic, fake heart attack 8 months ago. A heavy tactical boot stepped directly onto the center of his back, pinning his chest to the floorboards as an agent violently yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp, distinct double click of cold steel handcuffs ringing out through the quiet apartment was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. "Marcus Reed, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, interstate transport of stolen property, and identity theft," the arresting officer recited smoothly, pulling Marcus up by his cuffed wrists. Marcus was completely broken. His hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt was torn from the scruffle against the floor, and a thin line of sweat mixed with dirt smeared across his cheek.
As they dragged him backward toward the shattered doorway, he locked eyes with me one final time. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, begging humiliation.
"Chloe, please," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail as the agents hauled him down the corridor. "Don't do this to me. Talk to them. We can fix this. I love you, Chloe. Please." I didn't say a word. I stood at the threshold of the broken doorway, my arms crossed over my chest, watching his socks drag along the carpeted hallway as he was marched down the stairwell, surrounded by a wall of federal law enforcement. My phone vibrated in my palm. It was a direct call from Investigator Miller, who was stationed outside the luxury boutique hotel near JFK Airport. "Mrs. Reed, we have a secondary confirmation." Miller's voice came through the speaker, crisp and satisfied. "The local field office just executed a simultaneous warrant at the hotel. Jonathan Vance and his sister Tiffany were intercepted at the check-in desk. Their designer luggage was loaded into the back of a taxi, and they had 3 one-way tickets to Dubai sitting in their passports. They're currently in the back of a transport van heading to the federal holding facility downtown. The perimeter is completely clear." "Thank you, Arthur," I said quietly, hanging up the phone. I walked back into my quiet, messy kitchen. The candles were still burning, casting flickering shadows against the walls. The air still smelled of rosemary and premium steak, but the suffocating weight of the last 8 months had completely evaporated. The audit was finished. The liabilities had been completely stripped from the balance sheet. I blew out the candles, stepped into the bedroom, and for the first time in nearly a year, I fell into a deep, peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. 6 months later, the world had moved on, and so had I. Marcus was sitting in a maximum security cell at a federal penitentiary upstate, awaiting a formal trial that our prosecutors estimated would land him behind bars for the next 15 to 20 years, with absolutely no chance of early parole. The legal system had moved with a brutal, satisfying efficiency. Because the funds had been intercepted prior to clearing the international brokerage desks, and because my digital signatures had been weaponized under duress and fraudulent misrepresentation, the court-ordered asset forfeiture recovery program ruled completely in my favor. I managed to claw back nearly 85% of my liquidated assets. I recovered the full cash value of our Greenwich equity. I walked into the secure vault of that downtown estate jeweler and bought back my mother's platinum engagement ring, her Art Deco filigree bracelet, and her delicate South Sea pearls. I moved into a gorgeous, quiet, sunlit apartment uptown, overlooking the park, a place where the commuter trains couldn't shake my foundation, a place where the air felt clean, light, and entirely mine. I had won. I had closed the book on the fraud, balanced the ledger, and extracted absolute, clinical justice. Then, on a crisp Thursday afternoon in early June, a certified white envelope arrived in my mailbox. It bore the heavy, embossed blue typography of the United States Department of Justice, specifically from the Office of Medical Oversight at the federal detention facility where Marcus was being held during his pretrial phase. I sat down at my marble kitchen counter, a cup of green tea steaming beside me, expecting a standard legal update, a notice of a plea bargain hearing, or a deposition scheduling request from the federal prosecutor assigned to the wire fraud division. I broke the plastic security seal, pulled out the folded, multi-page document, and began to read. My breath caught instantly in my throat. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across the back of my neck, the paper rattling against my fingers as my eyes scanned the lines of text. This wasn't a forged PDF created on a luxury real estate office desktop. This document carried the authenticated biometric digital seal of a federal medical examiner, complete with certified lab cross-references and verified hospital intake timestamps. Inmate Intake Health Evaluation Matrix. Patient. Marcus Reed. Date of assessment. May 14th. Following repeated complaints of acute thoracic pressure, respiratory distress, and localized peripheral edema during mandatory exercise blocks, the inmate was transferred to the tertiary cardiac care wing for comprehensive diagnostic evaluation, including high-resolution contrast echocardiography and myocardial tissue biopsies. My eyes raced down to the clinical findings at the bottom of the page.
the text blurring as the sheer, impossible weight of the words hit my brain. Diagnostic summary. Patient exhibits advanced, irreversible structural pathology consistent with an aggressive, symptomatic presentation of idiopathic cardiomyopathy. The ultrasound imaging demonstrates severe, localized myocardial calcification, causing an acute loss of left ventricular elasticity. The cardiac tissue is experiencing accelerated muscular degradation and tissue hardening. Due to the rapid, atypical progression of the pathology observed over the last 90 days, the patient's cardiac output has plummeted below a sustainable threshold. Life expectancy is estimated at under 90 to 120 days. In accordance with federal guidelines for high-security pretrial detainees, the patient is strictly ineligible for outside medical transplant lists or domestic organ transfer protocols. Treatment remains purely palliative. I dropped the pages flat onto the marble counter, my hands shaking so violently that I knocked my spoon onto the floor.
Marcus hadn't just researched a rare, obscure heart condition to build the perfect financial scam. In his absolute, psychopathic dedication to the performance, in his hours spent drafting fake medical journals, forging ultrasound readouts, acting out violent chest-clutching collapses on our kitchen floor, and mimicking the raspy, suffocating breathing patterns of a dying man, he had literally manifested his own execution order. He had spent 8 months aggressively lying to the universe, weaponizing a fake death sentence to bleed his devoted wife wide dry and finance a luxury lifestyle with his mistress, completely unaware that his own biology was becoming meticulous, absolute notes. The exact, highly specific, rare cardiac trauma he had faked to destroy my life had actively materialized inside his own chest. His heart was turning to solid stone, precisely at the moment he lost his freedom, his money, his mistress, and his future. It wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was a flawless, terrifying, cosmic audit.
I sat in the absolute stillness of my new kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the clinical white pages spread across the clean marble counter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the large windows, casting long, geometric shadows across the room. But the warmth of the light couldn't penetrate the deep, icy realization that had settled into my bones. I reached out, my fingers tracing the raised, embossed federal seal on the medical report one final time. There was no joy in this discovery. There was no triumphant surge of adrenaline or celebratory relief. There was only a profound, almost terrifying sense of cosmic finality. Marcus had believed he was the ultimate director of his own reality. He had looked at my life, my love, and my financial security as raw materials to be mined, consumed, and discarded for his own pleasure. He had treated the sacred vulnerability of a marital bond like a high-stakes corporate embezzlement scheme, convinced that as long as his numbers looked clean on the surface, he could bypass the fundamental laws of human decency without ever paying the price. He thought he was entirely invincible because he was smart, charming, and visually perfect. But the universe doesn't operate on a delayed billing cycle, and it doesn't accept cooked books. I picked up the thick stack of medical documents, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely intact. I walked over to the corner of my study, where a high-end, heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sat next to my desk. I flipped the power switch on, the low, mechanical hum filling the quiet room. One by one, I fed the pages into the steel teeth of the machine. I watched as the official federal diagnosis, the high-resolution ultrasound metrics of his failing heart, and the final estimated timeline of his remaining days were systematically torn apart, reduced to thin, meaningless, unreadable strips of white confetti dropping into the plastic bin below. I wasn't going to visit him in the hospital wing. I wasn't going to send a letter, offer forgiveness, or provide him with the emotional closure he would undoubtedly beg for as his breaths grew shallower behind those prison walls. He had built his final destination with his own words, his own deceptions, and his own hands. He had spent months pretending to die of a broken heart just to steal a fortune, only for his own body to take him at his word, locking him inside a prison of his own calcified flesh. I switched off the shredder,
the sudden silence in the apartment feeling incredibly light, clean, and spacious. I walked out onto my private balcony, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of tea, and looked out over the sprawling, vibrant canopy of the city park below. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming summer jasmine and the distant, comforting murmur of urban life. I closed my eyes and took a deep, unrestricted breath, feeling the smooth, effortless expansion of my lungs and the steady, perfectly rhythmic, flawless cadence of my own pulse. Marcus had spent his entire life playing games with people's hearts, exploiting their trust to fund a lie. But in the end, the ledger always balances itself out. He lost his freedom, his money, his mistress, and the very life he took for granted. And as I stood there in the fading sunlight, watching the city glow beneath the evening sky, I knew one thing with absolute mathematical certainty. My heart had never beaten more perfectly.